From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kathy McGuigan. I'm from the Library of Congress, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to get started in just another minute, but I wanted to go through some housekeeping items for you. So our speaker will have the ability to talk, and you will have the ability to chat via the chat function. So if you would, just go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know where you're joining us from. And we'll just make sure that you can use the chat function. We are recording this session, so you'll be able to watch this at a later date. The program will last approximately 30 minutes, and there'll be time for question and answers at the end. Periodically, I'll be putting in links to the presentation today so that you can follow along and get a deeper look at some of the items that are discussed. So today's presentation is Charles Hamilton Houston and World War I. Before Charles Hamilton Houston became the chief attorney for the NAACP and a mentor to Thurgood Marshall, he was a young officer serving in a segregated military during the First World War. Curator Ryan Reft will discuss Houston's wartime experiences and their influence on his later work. A little bit about Ryan. Ryan Reft is a historian of modern America in the manuscript division at the Library of Congress. He is responsible for overseeing the manuscript division's collections related to 20th and 21st century law, journalism, domestic policy, and in some instances, culture. Ryan was part of the team for the Library of Congress World War I exhibit, Echoes of the Great War, American Experiences of World War I. I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to Ryan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Let me just get up the application here. Right, so let's get started. So we're going to talk about Charles Hamilton Houston, Black military service, civil rights, and World War I. And I will scroll down to this picture of him from 1939, obviously about 20 years after his wartime service. We're going to use Charles Hamilton Houston to talk about three major issues during this period. African-American life in Washington, D.C., both before, during, and after the war. The wartime experience of African Americans, both domestically and overseas. Now, Charles Hamilton Houston will have to juxtapose with the context of African Americans who stayed stateside to work in factories or elsewhere. But we'll obviously juxtapose that with his experience overseas fighting, well, in this case, serving in the military in France. And finally, civil rights. We'll interweave civil rights throughout, but we'll definitely come around at the end to discuss how the war shaped him, not only him, but also other Black veterans and even those people who didn't go to war overseas, but rather stayed to work in domestic industries towards the war. So what you have here is a letter from Wiliam Leroy Houston, Charles Hamilton Houston's father, and dated September 1918. You see the inset picture of Charles Hamilton Houston is during his training camp, his officer's training camp, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But I want to draw your attention to the second page on the right. I want to draw your attention to the second page on the right. Right next to where you see his face, you see no one has ever left home where parents had greater pride in him than we have in you. That's his father writing to his son, and I guess it's indicative of a part of African-American life you don't always see in this period, particularly rising middle class and familiar relations. Let me tell you about the Houstons just to give you a sense of the kind of family Charles Hamilton Houston came from. So Wiliam Leroy Houston was his father. Now, Wiliam Leroy Houston was the son of T.J. Hunn, Thomas Jefferson Hunn, who was an escaped slave from Kentucky, who walked to freedom and then worked in the Underground Railroad for a number of years. Through happenstance and serendipity, crossed paths with Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War. Grant took a liking to him, and he became an unofficial bodyguard to General Grant during the war. After the war, he meets Catherine Teresa Kilpatrick. She is also an escaped slave. So right off the bat, you see these are two people who are not willing to stand for anything less than equality. They both escaped slavery, they get married, they had 5 children. Wiliam LePre is one of those 5. Eventually they settle in the DMV area, the area around DC, Maryland, Washington, Virginia. He establishes, Thomas and Jefferson Hunt that is, establishes a thriving ministry in Maryland such that when he dies, over 1,000 people attend his funeral. His wife, Catherine, is a distinguished hairdresser, such that if one of her clients was Grover Cleveland's wife. He had a thriving ministry. She was a great hairdresser. Wiliam LePre himself eventually moves away, then comes back to DC. Now, why DC? After the Civil War, DC is in an approximate location, both the North and the South, particularly for freedmen and women whose slavery had ended. They moved north often to DC. Plus, you had a Republican government in control at the time. The Democrats had been kind of deposed during the war, eventually come back, obviously. But the Republican government, which had been friendly to African Americans and freedmen and women, is a source of employment. Now, not great employment. There'll be racism within the government such that African Americans really only get custodial, clerk-type positions. But nonetheless, a steady paycheck, particularly in an era when economic segregation and discrimination in employment was more than rampant. And the movement of African Americans to DC is pretty significant. By 1890, you have 75,000 African Americans living in the city out of a population of 225,000. So when Wiliam LePre moves back to DC, he gets a job in the War Department as a clerk, makes money during the day, at night goes to Howard Law School, and eventually establishes a fairly thriving law practice. During this time, he meets a Mary Hamilton Houston. They get married. She, like Wiliam LePre's grandmother, has a gift with cosmetics and hairdressing. She becomes a hairdresser to many of the elite white Washingtonians, diplomats, senators, and such. She made everyone call her Miss Hamilton Houston, and she always used the front door, refused to use the service entrance with her clients. A further demonstration of the kind of family that the Houstons were from, what W.B. Du Bois, the black leader, would call the talented tenth. Now, some people don't like that term because it's somewhat classist, but nonetheless, this kind of assertive, rising black middle class. That brings us to Charles Hamilton Houston. He goes to M Street School, graduates at age 15, and becomes the only student at the time, only black student at the time to attend Amherst College in Massachusetts. Now, what's going on at the same time that Hamilton Houston is having these experiences? Well, as early as 1910, you have African Americans from the South looking to move north for jobs and industry. When the war starts in 1914, that accelerates because immigration is stopped during the war, so the kind of labor that the northern factories were depending on was gone, so they need more labor. They look south, African Americans. But many African Americans also just wanted to escape Jim Crow's racism in the South. That's not to say that there wasn't racism in the North. There certainly was. But one primary difference between the North and the South is that if you move to a northern city like Chicago or Detroit or St. Louis, as many African Americans did, you have voting rights. They will become a major voting bloc in urban elections once the Great Migration kind of starts, accelerates, and ends. Now, keep in mind, this begins around 1910, doesn't end until around 1960, 1970. Both world wars are involved in, and both world wars accelerated. This letter from Fred White to the Bethlehem Baptist Association kind of demonstrates this larger thrust, written in 1917. Before we entered the war, keep in mind, America had gone from being a debtor nation to a creditor nation well before 1917. Before the war, so we were making a lot of money. You see in this letter, any information regarding condition will be greatly appreciated. I want to get away from here as early as possible. Let me hear from you soon. If you go to this slide, as African Americans moved north and south, and keep in mind, like 90% of them lived in the South and rural areas before the Great Migration. The war accelerates, move into cities like St. Louis and elsewhere, and they start competing with working class whites for housing and jobs. This causes a backlash among the white community, both because of these economic considerations, but also because of widespread racism. In St. Louis, in June of that year, there's a massive attack on black communities, such that 50 African Americans were killed and millions of dollars in damage or property damage, and the black neighborhood is basically burned to the ground. This happens in some other places as well, but this is the most prominent example. And this march, organized by NAACP, to protest that and to bring awareness to it, is indicative of these larger issues going on within America due to the war, but also the movement of peoples as a result of the war. So what about people like Charles Hamilton Houston? Well, there was debate in the black community about, well, it's fine to go move north and get a job and make money and for the war, but what about service? There was a debate in black community about whether or not it was a good idea to volunteer for the government or volunteer or to have to go to war, since they weren't getting the rights of citizenship they've been guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. What you have here is a picture of the 15th National Guard Regiment going to Camp Upton. There were dozens of camps across the U.S. They were segregated. The 15th National Guard is famous for becoming part of the Harlem Hellfighters, which are known for both their feats of bravery in battle, but also for the fact that James Reese, who we'll talk about later, was a member, and he was he led their jazz band, which regimental bands from the AEF spread jazz throughout Europe as a result of the war. Mostly these are African-American musicians and soldiers participating or playing in these bands, and the 15th is just indicative of that. Now, what about, there are others who said, well, I want to serve, but I want to serve as an officer. Charles Hamilton Houston is one of these people. The NAACP, students at historically black colleges and universities, what we call HBCUs, like Howard or Tuskegee, are advocating that there be an officers training camp. Now, they want an integrated camp, but that's not going to happen in this era, and so they eventually do get a segregated camp. Now, this letter that you see here from William August Pollard was sent to Mr. J.E. Spingarn. Mr. Spingarn was one of the co-founders of NAACP, and he had asked, prior to U.S. entrance into the war, for volunteers or people who were interested in serving in the camp. When the war comes, many more volunteer. They get hundreds of these, and we have hundreds of these in the NAACP papers collection. And as you can see, Pollard himself is a lawyer. He lives in New Haven, Connecticut. They wanted men from ages 25 to 35. They felt that a more mature group of men would be better for officers. I will say that when you go through these applications, and these are not official because this is not really how they selected the officer training camp, but these were early indications of a willingness by many African Americans, particularly among both the working class, like carpenters, and plumbers, and other skilled artisans and workers, and even those you might call in more white-collar jobs, that they were going to serve in this capacity. And again, the NAACP is front and center. The war really does accelerate the NAACP's role in guaranteeing civil rights for African Americans and really their place in the larger American society, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit later. So just to give you a sense of things, roughly just under 400,000 African Americans will serve overseas in the military. Most of them will be stevedores, camp laborers, clerks, because white Americans had kind of a schizophrenic relationship to black military service. On the one hand, they didn't want them carrying guns. In fact, they didn't even let them wear uniforms in some of the camps in the South at the risk of offending Southern sensibilities. But there were about 40 or 50,000 that do serve under French troops and some under white troops, white American officers who do see combat. So out of that 400,000, there is a large percentage that do see combat, but many of them did not. That does not, their work was absolutely vital and essential, but because of white Americans' reservations about African Americans carrying guns, they were trying to diminish that as much as possible. Now what you have here is Wiliam Leroy Parker. He was actually, just to give you a sense of the other branch of government. Now remember, there is no Air Force yet. However, you do have the Navy. The Navy did have some black members. They did have mixed crews, but again, they were occupationally segregated. What I mean by that is African Americans generally have the most menial positions, and we're not going to be making any kind of officer class. And after the war, basically the Navy boots out its African American sailors and doesn't accept new sailors that are African American until the 1930s. The Marines don't even take African American applicants. So the Army, which was undoubtedly racist in this period and segregated, is actually somewhat more progressive, you could argue, than the other two branches of the military at this time. So just to show you that the way these policies kind of expressed themselves was different according to the context of the military service. Now, there are men, as noted, the NAACP, college students like Charles Hamilton Houston, and also things like the Committee of 100, which was this collection of 100 African American leaders across the nation who were advocating for an officers training camp. This is a letter from Secretary of War Newton Baker to President Wilson, basically saying, look, we are going to do this. You see there's a reference to the Committee of 100 in the second line, but if you look at the selected text there. After considering the request, I came to the conclusion that training camp for colored people ought to be established. It has now been definitely fixed at Fort Dubuque, Iowa, with the full concurrence of the authorities of Howard University, Hampton Institute, and Tuskegee Institute. Again, 3 examples of HBCUs that were involved in advocating for this camp. Here you have a picture of the camp. You see Charles Hamilton Houston in the inset at the lower right. He's in that second row. About 1,200 men entered the camp. Roughly just 700 or so graduated from the camp, and about 639 officers, some of them captains, mostly first and second lieutenants, and these were mostly for just infantry. There was no artillery training at the camp. The camp officials themselves, under General Ballou, were not exactly respectful of the black trainees, which was not lost upon men like Charles Hamilton Houston and others who did not love the camp, but at the same time did want to serve their country and did want to demonstrate their right to citizenship. Now, Hamilton Houston is kind of disillusioned by the camp, so he goes off and gets artillery training after this camp. So what you see here are his buttons and his dog tags and a bullet from the training camp. He will actually get artillery training and go to Europe as a second lieutenant in artillery following this. Now, I'm going to scroll through a couple pictures of black soldiers and sailors from this period that a donor, Mr. Lindquist, was so generous as to give to the library for our second rotation. Lindquist, excuse me, I mispronounced his name. I think what's worth noting here is a couple things. In France, and keep in mind, France had its own ideas about race. They had colonies in Africa and Asia, Vietnam famously, Algeria. But African Americans who were serving in the military overseas found the lines of racial segregation drawn less starkly. They could date French white women without really any attitude from the French. Now, their white counterparts in the army were not happy about it and made their reservations very vocal. Charles Hamilton Houston himself witnesses a rather unpleasant exchange in Vannes, France. He's walking to the town center. He sees these 2 French women with these 2 white officers. They peel off from these officers to talk to these 2 African-American soldiers who spoke French. They kind of hit it off. This, of course, angers the 2 white officers. And what happens is basically you get African-American soldiers and white soldiers kind of crowding around the scene and things getting very, very tense and such that violence was about to break out until an MP shows up and tells them all to go home. Long story short, though, is that Charles Hamilton Houston is embittered by these experiences, by these attitudes he encounters, and by the fact he sees this other vision of what's possible, this kind of less starkly racial culture. That's going to make a mark on him and many of the other veterans who serve in the war, and that's just one illustration of this. I think he famously says at one point, the battleground for me was America, not France, and that the war in some ways erased the last vestiges of faith in the U.S. that he had had. Now, I think that was probably some despair going on because as we will see in a second, he does go on to really work towards a better America after the war, as do several other volunteers and enlistees from the war. In relation to this, it's worth noting that James Reese Europe, who was part of that 15th National Guard I mentioned earlier and became part of the Harlan Hellfighters, you see there, the 369th U.S. Infantry Hellfighters Band. And this is something that Charles Hamilton Houston will encounter, and I'll demonstrate this in a moment. On the left in France, you see James Reese Europe conducting his band. On the right, you see a playbill from one of the performances. What's very interesting about the war is that despite this discrimination, African-American troops brought jazz to Europe, a musical form that is distinctly American. Some people say it's one of America's few actual cultural contributions to world culture. And despite the levels of discrimination against them, they create this musical form that will eventually bring whites and blacks into the same space to enjoy culture together. And this takes time. It's kind of like the way you might want to think of rap in the 1990s. This is kind of the role that jazz played. But nonetheless, it's African-American regimental troops like the band led by James Reese Europe that do this, despite the discrimination going on. So spreading American values, culture in a different way, besides the idea of democracy, also occurred in War I. Hamilton Houston, this is not lost on him. In his diary from 1919 in January in Paris, he notes that Paris has taken away the jazz band and our style of dancing. Notice this is our style of dancing. Now that could be a reference to African Americans or just Americans. Colored boys are all the go. French girls are coming up and talking to them. So this is just a further demonstration of the kind of world that had opened up to many of these soldiers by going overseas. And that's not to say that white soldiers didn't have similar experiences about their kind of worldview after World War I, but it's particularly, they did, but it's particularly stark for African Americans who were kind of trapped in this situation in the States where they were being discriminated against, both North and South. Now, what does this mean for returning veterans? Well, there's a couple issues. One, black veterans were targeted for violence in parts of the country, particularly the South, particularly if they were wearing their uniforms. This is one of the things that leads the NAACP to engage in a anti-lynching campaign during the 20s. The NAACP itself will increase sixfold from roughly like 9,000 members to 63,000. Many of the AEF black veterans will join the NAACP and become civil rights activists themselves, besides Charles Hamilton Houston. There are other examples, such as Lewis T. Wright, a famous doctor who served overseas and comes back and works for the League for Democracy. Acela McCain, another one. Aiken August Pope. These are just three other men who came back and dedicated themselves to civil rights. Now, what they come back to is an economy and retrenchment such that something like 40% of veterans were unemployed. You can, if it's 40% of all veterans, you can probably assume that for African American veterans, that number was much worse. They also, the summer of 1919, you had over a dozen race riots in different cities, such that the NAACP Secretary James Weldon Johnson calls it Red Summer for all the blood that flowed, for all the deaths that occurred, and all the property damage as well. This inspires Charles Hamilton Houston, who had before the war thought about becoming a pianist or some kind of artist, to dedicate himself to the law and fighting segregation and discrimination, such that he goes to Harvard Law School. After graduating, spends a year or two in Europe studying international law, comes back, becomes dean of Howard Law School, trains a cadre of civil rights lawyers, most notably Thurgood Marshall. He will be hired by the NAACP in the mid to late 30s to lay out a plan for working towards desegregation and integration. He will bring Marshall into the NAACP. In the 30s, he argues in front of the Supreme Court a number of cases that will strike down segregation statutes in law schools and elsewhere, kind of building precedents that they build upon later. He will gain the nickname the man who killed Jim Crow. Now, he unfortunately dies in, I think, 1949 or 1950, so he never gets to see 1954 and Brown v. the Board of Ed. But Thurgood Marshall, who he brought into the NAACP, who he trained in the first place, will be the one who makes the arguments for Brown v. Board in front of the Supreme Court in 1954. So kind of comes full circle there. And that's just some of the ways that World War I affected not only Charles Hamilton Houston, but the larger African-American community and the civil rights movement through the NAACP, through the movement of African-American peoples from the South to the North and West, and to the changes in laws that eventually culminated in Brown v. Board of Ed in 1954. And with that, I'm open to taking questions if you guys have any.
Thank you, Ryan. That was wonderful. This is Kathy. As you can tell, we changed desks. I want to ask a question about if one wanted to spend more time researching this topic, what sources would you recommend?
I would recommend the book by Chad Williams, whose name, I'm forgetting the name of the book. Adrian Lent Smith also has a book called, I think, Freedom Fighters. Jennifer Keene's book on the larger military, I think, is very good also. I'd say those three authors have a pretty good handle and very readable styles. Yeah, that's where I would start.
Ryan, I'm not sure that you heard my question.
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So how did, we have a question that came in from Jane. She asks, how did the experience of African-American soldiers during the Spanish flu outbreak differ from that of white soldiers?
Well, I'm not sure that it did. I guess the one thing I would say is that Spanish flu affected everybody regardless of race. Though I would say that if you were at the front and you were actually in combat, you were probably, particularly for European combatants, they were often malnourished and in conditions that made catching the flu more likely because there were fewer African Americans who were actually at the front necessarily, like on the battle lines. That's not to say that there weren't, because even ones that weren't fighting who were in advanced positions, in logistical positions, they were still at the front. But many were not all, like I said, there were about 40 to 50,000 actually saw combat in the actual trenches. Those 43,000 might be because of malnourishment and conditions being wet and cold and in the elements. They might have been more susceptible to getting Spanish flu otherwise. But I don't think there would have been anything due to race itself, other than where they were placed because of discriminatory policies that would have made them more or less likely to have contracted the flu. The flu, by the way, kills vastly more people than the war. I think I've seen, and the estimates are very big, from 20 million to 60 million. They really don't know. But the flu was certainly, of all the things that came in the war, was the most deadly aspect of it in that regard.
Thank you for that. I'm going to put in a survey. If you don't have any more questions, I'm going to ask that you please fill out our survey with a link that I'm going to give you. And Ryan, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful program and hanging in there with all the technical challenges. But this was very enlightening and a very important topic. So I want to thank you for your research on this and sharing your knowledge about this topic. There is a question that came in from Shaylin, and I'm not sure that I understand it, but it is, what was the income?
Oh, right. You mean what were they paying the soldiers? Well, I know that I'm pretty sure black soldiers made the same pay as white soldiers. I don't remember what it was during the war exactly. I do know that when they do the pensions, it's $1 for every day if you were assigned domestically, and $1.25 for every day you were assigned overseas in terms of the pension, the bonus pension that was paid out in the 30s. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what pay was for white and black soldiers in the military, though I'm sure that officers made more and privates made less.
And what about when the soldiers returned in terms of the treating of the veterans? What was the differences there? Oh,
you mean in terms of rehabilitation, or do you mean just...
Yeah, the services that were available. Was there
okay.
A marked difference?
Right, good question. So disability is one of the things that really kind of pops up out of the war. You had I wouldn't say it's the first modern war, but because some people have cited the Russo-Japanese War, but this is really the first time you have people surviving with wounds we had not expected. So you do have a lot of people come back with limbs that are amputated or gone, and the government does make efforts to set up rehabilitation in 1918, but really a lot of the war, but only about 156,000 veterans who suffer disabilities really take advantage of that, and many of them, white and black alike, complain that when they're undergoing rehabilitation, the person assigned them to try and get them for training for a new vocation. Many of the soldiers, again, white and black, complained that the person didn't listen to them and tried to force them into certain vocations based on kind of class and racial prejudices that they had been carrying with them already. Black soldiers, though, are treated worse in the rehabilitation process. They complain about just general racial disrespect. They sometimes had to pay out of pocket. Their housing was often not as good as that of white veterans. There's also in 1917, the Red Cross establishes an institution for disability in New York City, though it was not initially established for the war. Because it's established around 1917, many soldiers will actually go there for rehabilitation as a result. So that was a lucky accident. But that was a non-government entity that was supplying that.
Interesting. Thank you. We had another question come in from Craig. He asks, does the library have photos from any of the other training camps? One of my great uncles trained at the 17th Provisional Training Camp at Fort Des Moines.
I can't comment exactly on what training camps we have. I think there are several. I think we probably have more of like Camp Upton and places like that. We actually have postcards from other camps, so I don't remember seeing one from Fort Des Moines. In general, that's something I have to check with prints and photographs. We did look at some camp photos for sure in some of the collections. We do have them. We don't have them such that they're displayed necessarily in the exhibit, however. We've gone with other means of kind of conveying that information.
That's great. And the thing that I'll add to that is that on every single page at loc.gov, at the top of the page, there is Ask a Librarian function. And there is a section for prints and photographs. So if you have a question specific to format, specific to a particular topic, you may submit the form and you'll get a response within 5 business days. And that goes for where Ryan works with the manuscripts division as well, so that you can ask a researcher at the Library of Congress. We have another question that came in. Was the Red Cross originally founded as an American organization and then expanded internationally, or was it originally set up as an international organization?
That's a good question that I'm not sure the answer of for the first part. I know that it becomes International Red Cross, and I know that this all happens in a period where there are more organizations that are starting to think about international realities and creating themselves as kind of these transnational, international organizations. I have a feeling it started in the U.S., but I can't say that with any authority. But this is the period where the Red Cross does become more international. So, and that's just due in part to the war itself, creating a more international world. Even though there is a lot of retrenchment after the war in terms of protectionism, particularly in the United States and elsewhere, it does ultimately lead to a more international world full of organizations like the Red Cross, particularly post-World War II.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, J.K., Craig, everyone, for your questions. This is going to conclude our program for the day. As I mentioned before, it is being recorded, and we will have it posted to the exhibition sites within the next 2 weeks. I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to especially thank Ryan for a really wonderful discussion today. Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.